Hello, and welcome to the second installment of this spring's Campus Conversations in Standish lineup. My name is Tyler Norton, and I'm the chair of the Campus Conversations Committee. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Now, Campus Conversations, we launched it in 2015, and the series aims to bring faculty research to the forefront, offering an exchange of ideas and perspectives within the campus, as well as across the communities of the Capital Region. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the other members of the committee: Camille Chesley, Irina Holden, Jane Kessler, and Mark Wolf. I thank the administration of the university libraries for the unwavering support of this important program, as well as to the Office of Communication and Marketing, particularly to Maggie Hartley, a noted friend of the Campus Conversation series. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Samantha Friedman is an associate professor of sociology. Professor Friedman holds a BA from the University of Buffalo and a PhD in sociology from Penn State. Her research interests cover housing and discrimination. And today, she is going to talk about disaster preparedness among older adults in the United States, which is what I call a feel-good story. Joking aside, I do want to note that we've had our eyes on Professor Friedman for a few years now. Her name repeatedly resurfaced when we met to plan the series, so it's really a pleasure to have her with us today. So, enough from me. The floor is now yours, Professor Friedman.
Thank you, Tyler, for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to you and your colleagues for inviting me to talk today and share some of my research. So let me share my screen here. So I will be talking about work that's in progress on disaster preparedness among older Americans in the US 2017, assessing the correlates of vulnerability. And I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Beth Fussell, who's at Brown, Dr. Xiao Lin here at UAlbany, and my students, Sarah McCarthy, who's a doctoral student in sociology, and Sherlyn Marcato, who's an undergraduate student in the communication department. So just as background, as I'm sure the audience is well aware, the US is increasing in terms of disasters. Between 2010 and 2019, the US experienced $119 billion disasters, nearly doubling from 59 disasters in the previous decade. Older Americans are vulnerable to the effects of severe climate hazards in terms of their mortality. For example, with Hurricane Katrina, 70% of those that died were over 60 years old. In Hurricane Sandy, nearly half of those that died were 65 and over. And hospitalizations via power outages, in part because of the increased reliance on power-operated home medical devices, is also on the rise, particularly as power outages are increasing very much as we go through climate change. So the main goals of our research is to use data from the 2017 American Housing Survey, and we address the following research questions. We ask, how prepared are older adults for disasters compared to the total population? How are social statuses of older adults associated with their preparedness, including those that indicate their housing conditions? And how do the perceived and actual risks of potentially experiencing a disaster, how are they associated with the preparedness of older adults? The FEMA definition of preparedness focuses on 4 dimensions, 3 of which are displayed here in the figure, and get involved is the 4th dimension. So the dimensions are make a plan, build a kit, be informed. We focus really in this research on the first 2 aspects. We're kind of limited to what the data has in terms of preparedness, which I'll get to when I talk about the data. Our study builds on the existing literature in at least 3 ways. Despite the rise in severe climate hazards, most literature on older adult preparedness relies on data from 2010 or earlier, which is quite surprising given this rise in billion-dollar disasters. A lot of the research relies on data from the 2010 Health and Retirement Survey, or on other primary data collection efforts, or on qualitative data efforts. Little research has examined the association between housing characteristics and preparedness, even though housing quality can indicate structural deficiencies like water leaks, cracks in the foundation, electrical problems. It could put a home at risk of damage. So it's surprising that little research has looked at the role of housing characteristics and the preparedness of individuals, particularly older adults. A study that I worked on is one study that does look at that, and we find that racial and ethnic differences in preparedness among the entire population is related, significantly related to housing tenure, whether folks own or rent their homes, and their housing adequacy. So those who lived in more adequate housing and those who are owners tended to be more prepared for disasters. Surprisingly, very few studies in the preparedness literature, not just those focused on older adults, examine the association between actual risks of experiencing disaster and the preparedness. To our knowledge, Malman is one of the only studies that looks at actual exposure to severe climate events and finds that it's associated with more preparedness. So more needs to be done looking at the impact of actual severe climate events on future preparedness. To predict the variation in preparedness of older Americans, the literature generally focuses on two categories of correlates. One set of correlates is social statuses that are linked to household or individual resources. And the other set are perceived and the actual risk of experiencing a disaster. The literature examining the association between social statuses and preparedness is somewhat mixed, however, in terms of predicting preparedness based upon the characteristic of interest. Education and income seem to be consistent predictors. Persons or households with higher levels of education and income tend to be more prepared than those with less education or income. However, disability status is a characteristic or social status that's not consistently associated with preparedness. Sometimes it is, and sometimes those with disabilities are less likely to prepare than those without disabilities. Race and ethnicity is also not consistently associated with preparedness. For example, few studies based upon recent national level data examine Hispanic preparedness. Among these studies, some find Hispanics are equally prepared as non-Hispanic whites. Others find Hispanics are significantly less prepared than whites. And what we're finding when we're reviewing this large body of literature is that part of the lack of clarity is because the studies don't measure all of these characteristics. And researchers, in their kind of efforts to examine the preparedness, don't always look at the same set of characteristics. So I think more needs to be done in terms of really putting forth more of a more solid theoretical framework moving forward so that we can, come up with policies that are going to help people prepare in the future. As far as perceived and actual risk of disaster, and associating with preparedness, there are theoretical models such as the protective action decision model that suggests that the perception of disaster risk and actual disaster experience make individuals more likely to prepare for future events. But the empirical findings are mixed in terms of supporting this theory. And some research actually finds that the self-efficacy or belief that one can act may be more important than the perceived risk of disasters in being associated with preparedness. Actual disaster experience has been associated with preparedness more consistently in the literature. However, actual disaster experience has largely been measured based upon self-reports. So, asking folks, have you experienced an actual disaster? So their response is based on their subjective reports of their experience. As I indicated earlier, only one study to our knowledge examines actual exposure to experiencing a severe climate event or events. So it's unclear, essentially, from our reading of the literature, it's unclear how living in an area with a severe climate event affects the preparedness. People's perceptions of their exposure could be more important than their actual exposure. And I think that's something that the research moving forward needs to clarify, again, to make policies or guidelines that help people better prepare. So the theories are going to inform the analysis that we present today. The data are based upon metropolitan samples of the 2017 American Housing Survey. These are multi-stage probability samples of housing units in 25 separate metropolitan areas. And the Census Bureau calls these core-based statistical areas, or CBSAs, and they're representative of the housing in those areas. The 2017 data are used because it includes a topical module on disaster planning and preparedness. And this is the second time that the American Housing Survey includes these questions. The first was in 2013. And the American Housing Survey is administered by both the US Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. The data are very useful to us because they already include rich data on housing and neighborhood conditions, as well as on socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. And we restrict our households to those with persons age 65 and over. So only including in the household those 65 and over. So across all of our metropolitan samples, we have a sample size, an analytical sample size of 4,340. And then if we restrict that to homeowners, it's about 3,100. We also include data from FEMA, which is maintained by our UAlbany Visualization and Informatics Lab here on campus, Avail. And they have a very nice data linkage interface, which you can see here, www.hazarddata.org. So what we do is, because we know the exact metropolitan area in which the respondents live, we wanted to look at exposure to actual severe climate events. So we looked at a 2-year exposure in 2015 and 2016, and the data are provided at the county level of analysis. So we looked at whether any county in the 25 CBSAs had a disaster declared by FEMA for any kind of severe weather event, flooding, windstorm, tornado, hurricane, any kind of event. So you can get all that data for every single county over time, I believe back to the mid 1990s on this hazarddata.org. So it's very, very useful. We sum the number of times for all the counties in each of the 25 CBSAs, and we merge these data to the 2017 American Housing Survey data. So just to elaborate on that, because the data are put forth by the US Census Bureau, they maintain the strictest level of confidentiality. What does that mean? It means that for each respondent in our data, we only know what metropolitan area they live in. We don't know the exact county in which they live. So what we did is we summed all the possible events that could have happened in all of the counties in a given CBSA. So that's how we decide whether or not a disaster occurred or not in 2015 and 2016. Our key dependent variables are, we use a question about whether the household has the emergency supply kit available. So these are asked of all households, and in our case, we're restricting it to those who just have persons 65 and older. So households are asked in the survey if emergency supplies are readily available to take with them if they had to evacuate from their homes. So we just look at an indicator variable. Yes, they have supplies ready. No, they do not. We also focus on the presence of a generator, which is only restricted to households living in a single housing unit or multi-unit buildings with just 2 to 4 units. So those that live in larger multi-unit buildings are not asked these questions. And they're asked, do they have a generator available to provide electricity in the event of a power outage? Finally, we focus on flood insurance, and this is only asked of people who are living in owner-occupied homes. So we restrict our analysis to only those who are owners. The flood insurance question is posed as whether it was purchased because it was required for the home purchase or refinance, or whether it was purchased for other reasons, a neighbor bought it or some other reasons. So we look at a multi-category variable. Our key independent variables that we focus on are disability status, whether the household contains one person with a disability. It could be an ambulatory disability, it could be a vision disability, a hearing disability. So it's all combined into one category. We look at race and ethnicity, which is defined by the householder's response to the question about their race, and also a separate question about whether they are of Hispanic origin. And we combine those variables and focus on the major racial and ethnic categories, realizing that there are limitations. We can't look at specific groups underlying these broader categories. We look at age, which is a continuous variable of the householder's age, ranging from 65 and over. And we look at housing inadequacy. So we're interested in whether the housing unit is moderately or severely inadequate. So severely inadequate housing units have at least one of the following problems. They have a lack of plumbing, significant heating problems, no electricity, considerable electrical wiring problems, 5 maintenance problems among the following 6: outside water leaks, inside water leaks, holes in the floors, holes or cracks in the walls or ceiling, large areas of peeling paint or broken plaster, signs of rats. Moderately inadequate housing units have at least one of the following. They have 3 or 4 maintenance problems listed above, or they have one of the following problems: toilet breakdowns, use of unvented gas or kerosene heaters as the main source of heat, and lack of adequate kitchen facilities. Finally, we look at whether the neighborhood is perceived to be at risk of disaster, to get at the perceptions of the disaster risk, which is defined by the householder's response to the question whether they agree with the following statement: this neighborhood is at high risk for floods or other disasters. And finally, we use that variable I indicated that comes from the Avail data set that we merge with our individual level data, which is FEMA disaster declared in the CBSA in 2015 or 2016. So it basically is a variable indicating whether any of the counties in the CBSA had a disaster declared by FEMA in those years. We include a range of control variables, including housing tenure, just in the emergency supply kit, and the generator analysis, the year the housing was built, the type of unit, how much the unit pays for homeowners or renters insurance, household level education, poverty status, the nativity status of the household, marital status, and the number of years the person was living in the unit. For methodology, we use logistic regression modeling for the outcomes, emergency preparedness kit, and presence of a generator. We use multinomial logistic regression for the flood insurance outcomes, which is appropriate when their dependent variable is more than 2 response categories. We do use the sampling weights provided by the American Housing Survey, and they're scaled to the sample size. And our standard errors are adjusted for the clustering that are within the CBSAs. So let me turn to the results. What we do in the first figure here is look at the preparedness outcomes that we're interested in, as well as the other preparedness outcomes in the data set. And we look, the red bar is for older households, and we wanted to compare it to all households in the AHS, just to give you a sense of are older adults very different from the total population. So I'm going to start from the most kind of prepared outcomes. They do ask whether folks have a vehicle to evacuate in the event of an emergency. They ask folks if they have enough food, to get through 3 days, non-perishable food. They ask if they have emergency funds of at least $2,000. They also ask if people have about 64 gallons of water per person, in terms of water. And then we get to the definitions that I've already discussed. We decided to focus on the definitions that I had discussed earlier, because we're not sure if these other characteristics are really gauging actual preparedness, or whether people whether people have a car to get to work. As you can see, older households and all households, 90% of all households have a vehicle, and slightly less of older adults have a vehicle. Does that mean that they have a vehicle just in the event to evacuate, or do they have a vehicle every day for everyday use? Likewise, the statistics in terms of the percentages having emergency food, emergency funds, are also around the 80% mark for both older Americans and the total population. So again, it doesn't really, to us, it's not clear whether that's just resources that they have anyway, and whether or not that is a gauge of actual preparedness. Emergency water is a little bit lower. It's just over 60% for all households, and closer to 70% for older adults. Again, we decided to focus on things that were closer to the 55% mark. Although the results, we can discuss the results. The patterns are somewhat similar in all of these characteristics. But I think it's important to raise awareness about the outcomes that older adults and the total population are not as prepared for, and to focus on those to see, what kind of messages should FEMA be giving? What should we be doing in the future as far as the critical nature? How might these levels of preparedness impact people's health and well-being? So emergency supplies, like I said, is lower. Like about 55% of older adults have the emergency supplies ready to evacuate. But what's even more alarming is that, there are just fewer households among the older adults and the total population, under 20%, that actually have a generator. And for older adults, this seems like it's going to be critically important, because in work that I've done with Dr. Xiao Lin, just for New York State, we find that since 2013, there is a very large increase in power outages in New York State, and I suspect that this will go up. So this is going to affect people who are older adults, who rely on, oxygen if they have respiratory diseases like COPD. If they're on dialysis, they need, power operated medical devices. So to me, I think that this is something that we need to raise the awareness of. With respect to flood insurance, our data are capturing very few people that have been required to purchase flood insurance, and it's actually lower among older adults. And we also see that less people are, buying flood insurance for other reasons, for other protective reasons. So that's something I think we need to look more into, both with these data and other data as well. So what I want to do is look at the results from the multivariate analysis to see, out of our key characteristics, what factors are associated with our outcomes of interest, controlling for the other factors that I mentioned in the slide. So what I present here are results from our multivariate analyses in the form of confidence intervals. And so for those of you not like terribly proficient in logistic regression, what you should focus on is the confidence interval, and the dot in the middle is the point estimate. So basically what that tells us is the ratio of the odds of those who are disabled of having emergency supplies versus those who are not disabled of having emergency supplies. So if the odds of the disabled having emergency supplies are lower than the odds of those that are not disabled, then this measure will be lower than 1. If the odds of those that are disabled of having emergency supplies are greater than the odds of the non-disabled, then our estimates and our confidence interval around the estimates will be greater than 1. So if the confidence interval helps us gauge the statistical significance. So under repeated sampling, would we see estimates that fall, where the confidence interval does not cross 1 and the groups are equal? If the confidence interval does not cross 1, that means the finding for that group is statistically significant and is associated with our preparedness outcome of interest. Even, meaning that if we were to take repeated samples of the population, we would find that the characteristic is indeed associated with the outcome we're showing. So what we see here is that the odds of those who are disabled of having emergency supplies are lower than the odds of those who are non-disabled. And it is statistically significant. Interestingly, we find that the odds of having emergency supplies among Blacks is actually higher than among non-Hispanic whites, controlling for other factors, and that's also statistically significant. We find no statistically significant association with Hispanic, Asian, and age. We do, however, find that those who live in inadequate housing are less likely to have emergency supplies than those who live in adequate housing. Interestingly, though, the perceptions of neighborhood risk, whether they perceive there would be a flood or other disaster in their neighborhood, is not significantly associated with whether they have emergency supplies, nor is our indicator of whether their metropolitan area experienced a disaster or a severe climate event in 2015 and 2016. So our perceived and actual exposure is not significantly associated with emergency supplies. What about in terms of having a generator? So disability status is not significantly related to having a generator, controlling for other factors in our model, but we do see that race and ethnicity is significantly associated. And for Blacks, the pattern is opposite in the previous finding. So we find that older Black adults are significantly less likely to have a generator than non-Hispanic whites. And the same is true for Hispanics and Asians. We also find that a negative relationship with age in that the older of the 65 and older group are significantly less likely to have a generator than the younger group of the older adults. Again, we don't find any significant relationship with inadequate housing, and we also don't find any evidence of the perceived neighborhood risk or the exposure in terms of the FEMA declaration of a disaster area in the metropolitan area. As far as whether, looking at the odds ratios of flood insurance being required versus having no flood insurance, we find that Blacks are significantly more likely to be required to have flood insurance than non-Hispanic whites. We also find that to be the case for Asians. And we find that older age individuals are much more likely to be required to have flood insurance, as well as inadequate housing is more likely to be associated with being required to have flood insurance. We also find that in this case, the neighborhood risk, perception of risk is associated with being required to have flood insurance, but exposure to, whether they live in an area that had a FEMA disaster is not significantly associated. Finally, in terms of looking at the flood insurance outcome of whether they have flood insurance because they're neighbors or for other reasons versus not having insurance, the only characteristic we find to be statistically significant is that perception of neighborhood risk. So those that are perceived to have, consider that they would have a flood or other disaster are significantly more likely than those who don't perceive a neighborhood risk of flood or disaster to have flood insurance. So let me summarize the main findings and discuss the implications. Older adults in metropolitan America are least prepared for severe climate events in terms of having emergency supplies, a generator, and among homeowners, flood insurance. These predictors of preparedness however, are not consistent across these indicators. Those with disabilities, older adults among the old, and those living in inadequate housing tend to be less prepared than those without disabilities, the younger of the old, and those living in inadequate housing. But the association between race ethnicity seems to vary by the outcome. So that is not as consistent as the other measures. In terms of perceived and actual exposure to disaster, perceptions of neighborhood risk of disaster are only associated with having flood insurance among homeowners. However, residents in CBSAs that have not been declared FEMA disaster areas in 2015 or 2016 is not associated with any preparedness outcome. Our findings suggest, at least from this iteration of the analysis, that social statuses may be more important in being associated with preparedness among older adults than previous exposure to disasters. People of color and the oldest adults are less likely to have generators than whites and the younger of the old. And these groups already tend to have poorer health outcomes. As severe climate events become more frequent, these groups will likely be more vulnerable to further declines in health because of the frequency of power outages is increasing. By 2030, this is just a short 8 years away, 21% of Americans will be 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 years of age and older. So increasing their preparedness to reduce their vulnerability to severe climate events should be a top priority. There are some limitations I want to talk about and some next steps that we want to go with this work. Our results are limited by the measures of preparedness in the AHS data, the limited number of older adults, and the availability of data at the CBSA or metropolitan level. More research clearly needs to be done at a finer level of geography below the CBSA or metropolitan level to determine whether or how exposure to disasters or severe climate events at that level is significantly associated with preparedness. We need to also examine other segments of the population and variation among those segments of the population, like disabled persons overall and by the type of disability. Little research has focused on this, so that's a next step in our research. We also need to examine how the neighborhoods within which older adults reside may be associated with their preparedness. This analysis, because the data have strict confidentiality rules, we don't know many characteristics of their neighborhoods. We should be looking at, obviously where people live is not random and is built on a profound history of structural racism. And we need to look at that because some of the inconsistent findings with respect to race could relate more rather than the individual race. It's likely related to the structural racism and residential segregation between people of color and whites is very high in many metropolitan areas, and that no doubt shapes where people live in terms of their housing quality, and is likely patterned to be in areas that are profoundly affected by severe climate events. So we must take that into account to then look at their preparedness. So looking at the notion of historical institutional redlining is important. How is preparedness associated with people living in formerly redlined areas? What about people living in very high poverty areas versus affluent areas? How does that shape individual preparedness? What about areas that have high crime and social disorganization versus areas with low crime? What about areas with greater levels of environmental exposures, like higher levels of PM 2.5, higher levels of lead exposure? How does that shape preparedness? In some analyses I didn't show you, it is the case that Black households, and when we look at the overall sample, not just restricted to older adults, are significantly more likely than whites to have emergency water. And a lot of that is likely linked to the environment in which they live, with many areas facing water crises, and people of color living in those areas are used to having to buy their own water supply rather rely on the public water supply. So these things need to be looked at. So how can we do that? So the next step in our research program is to apply for access to the New York State Federal Statistical Research Data Center. That's a mouthful, so what we can call it is just for short, the RDC. The RDC, we at UAlbany have a seat at the RDC. Our Vice President for Research Office pays for our UAlbany membership at the RDC, which allows us to use data at Baruch College at the CUNY Grad Center, as well as Cornell. Those are the two RDCs in New York State. What does that allow us to do? Well, through a rigorous approval process that can take up to a year, it allows us to access the non-publicly available data from the American Housing Survey, where we could then access the neighborhood characteristics. We can know where the respondent essentially lives, their actual neighborhood where they live, and we can match it with some of these characteristics to get a more fine-grained analysis about the context and where people live. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the show and open it up to the Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Friedman. I don't know about you, but I was just going through and thinking about how I need a disaster plan now. It's like,
Yeah.
I am.
Just think about getting a generator. That's my priority. And if you live in an area with a moderate risk of flooding or a low risk even, you should also consider maybe looking into that, because homeowners insurance does not cover it. And according to the data from FEMA, 1 in 3 claims actually come from the more moderate risk areas. So it's something that should be on everybody's radar screen.
Yeah, and apparently a lot of water. So,
Yeah.
all right. Any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, the Q&A function, either or, and I'll present them. Camille, go for it.
So, as I was listening, I have to admit that some of the math went a little bit over my head. But like a librarian, as you were talking and you were mentioning some of your sources, I went looking for them. And, one of the things that I found fascinating is that just from my cursory view, I didn't kind of see the first thing that came to mind as you were talking was Florida, because it's the greatest state in the nation, and it's Florida. And yeah, and so I guess this was more of a comment, but I was interested in how you might see some of your your research being applied, or do you see your research and research like yours being applied in in areas like Florida, which people keep telling us are going to be underwater in 50 years or so.
I mean, it's a great question. And I think with a fine-grained analysis, what I'm very curious, because I'm also a demographer. So what I'm very curious actually is there's a large scale migration, especially of older adults, to Florida. So I'm really curious about isolating those, folks that, I think just anecdotally of my neighbor next door, they spent half their time in Florida and they just bought a waterfront property. And then they spend half their time here in, Albany, New York area. So I just would love to know, since they just built a home on the waterfront, how prepared are they? So are households that live closer to like major bodies of water, that live in places like Florida, that have more of a threat, are they basically going to be more prepared? I mean, our preliminary analysis doesn't find variation across these metropolitan areas, which is surprising, but I think part of the reason for that is because it's just so aggregated. So, think about Hurricane Sandy. If someone is living in the New York metropolitan area, which not only includes the 5 boroughs of New York City, but also Jersey City, Newark, Westchester, Long Island. If something happens in Long Island, and it doesn't happen in the Bronx, then people in the Bronx may not be prepared. So I think getting access to like a finer grained analysis of closer to where people live is going to tell us a lot more. And I think that would be very informative in terms of the looking at Florida as a great example.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. There we go. We have a couple questions in the chat. One is from Karen, who first loved the presentation. And she also notes that the generators, they're expensive, they require a lot of maintenance, and older adults or folks without a significant amount of income would struggle to have one. So is it a fair baseline requirement for preparedness, or should the baseline be having a plan, having a go bag?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Karen, and thank you for attending. Our analysis, just keep in mind, because of the use of multivariate statistics, our analysis does make equal people's financial situations. Having said that, I think there are two things that we need to think about, which is, just making the technology for generators more affordable, because this is an increasing problem in the future. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but it seems to me that, and there seems to be a movement. I don't know a lot about this, but what I'm hearing from others is that there are developments of solar-based generators, which could be promising and could be more affordable. So I think it's something that we need to find creative ways to power. I mean, now there's been a lot more movement, for example, to but solar based. So there is a more of a movement of harnessing energy in a solar way, that even that, like putting solar panels on people's roofs, has become more affordable. I think we need to raise attention to this issue because of the necessity, particularly of older adults and their increased reliance on power generated medical devices. So I feel like we just need to raise the awareness and see what kind of interventions we can have and make it more affordable. But our analysis does take into account by making equal people's economic status, to see what characteristics would, making that equal, would they be less likely or more likely? And I think with respect to the oldest old, what troubles me is, because we're taking into account income, what troubles me is the accessibility, that these are older adults living on their own. And I think they're just not having the capability of being able to access that technology. And I think that's a challenge that raises a different set of questions, that we need to be able to make it accessible so that people can go out and have options. And I think that when you're dealing with an age group that has difficulties accessing the internet and apps, it's really something that I think we have to pay more attention on a very basic level. Like, how do they access the information, which is consistent with make a plan and FEMA's ultimate goal.
Great, thank you. Another question we have, this one's from Jody, and Jody asks about what are the implications, if any, related to the shift from older Americans preferring or being forced to age at home today compared to living in intergenerational families or in retirement communities or nursing homes?
That's a great question, Jody. And I think it kind of piggybacks off something I just mentioned, which is the ability of older adults who do age at home to, number one, have access to information that's readily available to make decisions about what to do to protect themselves. And number two, aging at home could be a home that wasn't affected by climate change, all of a sudden is much more affected by, whether it be windstorms, or whether it be I think of my parents living in the same home for 45 years, and their trees are a lot bigger now than what they were when they moved into their home. So, managing the risks just in their yard or just in their neighborhood of the, damage from trees and things like that, and power lines. And the third thing is, we have to realize that, there are, and I don't have the specific statistics, but it's something I think as a demographer, I think more about than maybe the regular academics or other academics, is a lot of people decide when they're kind of entering retirement in their 60s, late 60s, mid to late 60s, I'm going to move to Florida. And they end up moving so far away from any family member. And so when they end up moving down there, it becomes very challenging to help them if they have to age at home in a completely different region of the country, a region that tends to be, if you're in the Southeast, more prone to these severe climate events. So I think that's something that we really need to, the communication and plans need to be developed, not just to like leave your house in the event of evacuation, but I think needs to be discussed in terms of reaching key family members and what would you do if they're inaccessible for like a week-long period. You know, it's really difficult and challenging.
Thank you. All right, if we have time, one more question maybe. I don't know if we have any left in the queue, but if not, have any closing thoughts, Professor Friedman? Anything you'd like to share?
I'd just like to say that I'm thrilled that UAlbany has made you know, a focus on you know, the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness as a signature strength at our campus. I think that it's very, very smart in the you know, increase as severe climate events increase. I think that it's really important, and that we have a center point of intellectual capacity to potentially, you know, bring a lot of solutions to these problems. And it's very exciting that many people coming from very different disciplines are speaking to this very important issue as we move forward. And I think the new VPR's strategy to build artificial intelligence is something that can really help, you know, help decision makers in as these severe climate events, you know, increase over time, which will have positive effects for not only older adults but the society at large. So it's I think UAlbany is really in a good position moving forward in the future.
Fantastic. It looks like we are right at the buzzer. So I will thank Professor Friedman, thank everybody who attended, all the great questions. This was wonderful, and we'll have the recording up on YouTube soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody.